and welcome everybody. I see that the audience is still coming in, so that's just wonderful. Welcome to those who are here. Welcome to those who are still connecting. I am so delighted to see so many of you. I am thrilled to be able to give a pre-introduction to our outstanding speaker today, Professor Randall Hughes, who will be properly introduced by the chair of the Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences, Professor Jeffrey Trussell. You know, these seminars that we have in the College of Science Connect series gives you a huge sense of the outstanding research that the college is engaging in. Our commitment to science is enormous. The power of science is enormous. It is unprecedented. It is the reason that we have been able to overcome the coronavirus and the reason that many of you are vaccinated or waiting eagerly to get vaccinated. It is all about science training and research, and we are so proud that the College of Science is part of this great mission. In the college, we have a number of different elements of research, and one of our most important focuses on the environment, and our Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences is a foremost department in the world that engages in the study and the practical considerations around the health of the oceans and coastlines. I am enormously proud of the faculty that are in this department and the trajectory of the department as led by Professor Trussell. This is a wonderful part of the whole Northeastern culture. As we go forward with Northeastern science, our emphasis on the environment, on the health of the environment, on the relationship between healthy economies, jobs, careers, and the health of our planet are going to become ever more important and ever more a focus of Northeastern. And the Marine and Environmental Sciences Department is at the forefront of this effort. I want to thank those of you who have contributed to the trajectory of people in the Marine and Environmental Sciences Department and to this wonderful initiative that we have in the College of Science. I value your considerations, your generosity, your connection with us in the college. It is enormously important to all of us to engage with you, our alumni, our parents, and our very kind supporters. Please do look at the sheet that we gave out today that highlights Professor Randall Hughes and her work and the Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences and the work that they do. We are always so pleased to connect with you on opportunities for engaging with this department and with this extremely important work relating to the environment. And without further ado, let me introduce Professor Jeffrey Trussell, who will speak to you and introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Randall Hughes, and at the risk of embarrassing Randall a little bit, I'm going to do so anyway. When we first started building this department and our Coastal Sustainability Institute about 8 years ago, we started thinking about who we would like to bring in to help us move that mission forward. And Randall literally was one of the first people I thought of. And so Randall was among the first cohort of people we hired about 8 years ago. And over that time, we've now hired about 16 people in support of our research and educational mission. One of the reasons why I found Randall to be such a compelling scientist is she's one of these individuals, rare individuals, that can marry both the world of fundamental research as well as translational research. A lot of folks think that these are two independent enterprises, but in reality, translational research can be an emergent property of fundamental research. And so Randall is doing key work that's looking at the links between biodiversity and the functioning of natural ecosystems. And that is, of course, of interest to a lot of scientists purely from a fundamental perspective. But the insights that Randall has gleaned during the course of her work is having important translational outcomes. For example, how do we restore coastal ecosystems using biological principles to enhance the success of those restorations? Now, what makes Randall really special in my mind is not only her compelling success as a researcher, and to put this in perspective, even though Randall is a late career associate professor, soon to be full professor, she's outperforming everyone in our department in terms of citation metrics and publication success. So, you know, we've got 6 or 7 full professors in our department, and Randall is more highly cited and more impactful than those individuals. It just speaks to the relevance and novelty of her work. Perhaps even more special about Randall is her ability to integrate her research with her teaching. And as great evidence of that, Randall was recently awarded a career grant from the National Science Foundation. This is one of the most prestigious awards given by the foundation to early career investigators to help them accelerate the potential linkages between their research program and their teaching efforts. And of course, if one looks at Randall's teaching successes throughout the department over the years, she's always among the highly rated teachers in our department. Perhaps most importantly though, and this speaks to why Randall is really emerging as a true leader in our department, is that she's really leading a lot of the progress that we're making as a community. Randall was the founding chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which really helped galvanize a lot of efforts at our department, within our department, to better understand the challenges that systemic racism and marginalization of communities has created for society. And given Randall's immense success on that front, as you know, she is now the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion within the college. So Randall is one of these rare individuals. I know this is a research seminar, but I thought it was important to highlight. Randall is not just a researcher. She's an incredible teacher. She's an incredible member of the community. Her heart is as big as her brain. And we're very, very fortunate to have her in our department. And I think we're all on this call very fortunate to be hearing her speak today. So Randall, it's a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Hazel, as well. And thanks to all of you who are here in the audience on what I know is the first, thankfully, of several really beautiful days that we've had in a while. So I appreciate your taking your lunch hour to be on Zoom with me. And I'm really excited to tell you about some of the work that we have going on in my group, trying to understand the causes and consequences of changes in marine biodiversity. And as I get started, I first just want to acknowledge the many undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and collaborators who have contributed to this work. None of what I'm going to talk to you about today would have been possible or nearly as fun without these folks. So I'll highlight some individuals as we go through, but there's no way to call out everyone. So I just wanted to give a general acknowledgement to start. Now, when many of us think of marine biodiversity, one of the first images that comes to mind is something like this picture of the Great Barrier Reef. Or maybe you take a longer term perspective and think more about the tree of life and the evolutionary relationships among species. And despite the complexity of this diagram, which I'm not going to go into the details of, even it doesn't capture many of the really critical aspects of diversity that we in my group are interested in. So for example, if we focus simply on one tip of one of these branches on these on this tree, then we find a species that has a lot of really visible variation just within a single species, such as man's best friend. That is also true if we look at the plants. You have species that have really incredible variation in flower color. And moving into the marine environment, we have really iconic marine species such as cod that also have this really visible sort of color and morphological variation. And so this is the sort of thing that we're really interested in my lab group. Yet we study species where it's not quite so obvious what the differences are, and it's not quite as easy to tell different individuals. So we work in a range of coastal ecosystems, including seagrasses, salt marshes, and oyster reefs. These habitats are formed by these single foundation or habitat providing species. And so the variation that may be present within these species, even though it's hard to see, is not any less important to understand. And so I won't go into the details today, but we use a variety of DNA markers and genetic techniques to help us identify sort of who's who in these habitats. And so, as I mentioned, we're working across a range of coastal ecosystems. And today I'm really going to hone in on one of those just to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing. I'm going to focus on seagrasses. So this is eelgrass, Zostra marina, and it's found throughout the Northern Hemisphere, including here off the coast of Massachusetts. And eelgrass, you may be important to you for a number of reasons, one of which is it is habitat to a wide range of fish and invertebrate species, many of which we like to eat. So without eelgrass, we would not have those that tasty seafood. And I'm interested in eelgrass in addition because it has a really interesting life history in that it can reproduce clonally below ground with these underground rhizomes. So you can have multiple individuals above ground that are the same genetically. And it can also reproduce sexually. This is a seagrass flower that will then produce seeds. And so potentially there's a wide range of diversity that could be present in these eelgrass beds. And so we're interested in what impacts that may have. So sort of general questions that we ask in my group is, does genetic diversity matter in species like eelgrass? And what happens if it changes? And these questions fall under the broad categories of ecology and evolution. And in particular, we're interested in whether there are feedbacks between ecology and evolution. All right, so one of the first questions that we had to answer when I started this work was, is there any genetic variation in eelgrass? Conventional wisdom was at the time, because we rarely see successful seedling recruitment, that a football field sized meadow could have been a single genetic individual or genotype. But when we went out and sort of focused on 1 meter square areas, which is the sort of scale at which individuals are really interacting with one another and at which we can manipulate them, and we sampled 20 different shoots in that meter square, we found a wide range of diversity. So there are some plots that are dominated by a single genetic individual or a single genotype, but there are some that have up to 15 different genotypes present, and with an average of around 3 or 4. So we took this information and used it to design a field experiment. This is an intertidal seagrass bed in Bodega Bay, California, where I started this work. And we planted 1, 2, 4, or 8 known eelgrass genotypes in these plots, and then watched it over time to see if any differences would emerge that we could measure based on that initial number of genotypes. So about 6 months into the experiment, here's what one of those plots looked like. It was at low tide, so it's maybe not as pretty as if we had gone in at high tide and snapped some images. But you can see that, there's a healthy number of plants. They're looking good. And importantly, there was no difference that we were able to measure between, sort of the low diversity plots and the high diversity plots. So that was a little, maybe discouraging. We were hoping for some differences. And then this was around December, and that's when brant geese migrate into Bodega Bay, and they like to graze on eelgrass. And I very quickly felt like I was trapped in the Alfred Hitchcock film, The Birds, which was filmed in Bodega Bay, because basically the geese ate my experiment. So you can see this is a picture of the same plot a month later after the geese arrived, and those long, healthy eelgrass shoots that have been about 1 meter long were now about 5 centimeters tall, and lots of them were missing entirely. So this was a bit discouraging. But when I went and looked at the data and compared the percentage of shoots that were remaining following this grazing event relative to what had been there previously, we found this really clear and striking relationship where the more diverse plots had a greater percentage of shoots remaining. So the disturbance, the grazing event, was not as stressful for them. And in addition, it took 4 to 5 months for these plots to recover to their pre-grazing densities. And because they weren't knocked back as hard, those more diverse plots recovered more quickly. And so this was really exciting because it indicates that there is an important role ecologically for genetic variation in eelgrass. Now, I just want to take a minute because I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking about the geese, and some of you may be really curious about them. And so I want to highlight this wonderful children's book that was recently published by Dr. Nicole Collars, who is a recent addition to the Hughes lab. She's a postdoctoral researcher in the lab. Nicole did her dissertation work at UC Davis, looking at interactions between eelgrass and geese. And she wrote this wonderful story in part to honor, and in fact, the proceeds go to a scholarship fund in honor of Dr. Susan Williams, who was an amazing pioneer in marine science and a mentor to many of us, including both Nicole and me. So I really encourage you to check out Susie and the eelgrass geese. All right, so the geese took us a little bit by surprise. We had not expected them to come and eat the experiment. And so the question arose, well, is it just some oddity of these geese eating eelgrass, or is it a more general phenomenon? And so we followed up, we and others followed up with a range of experiments and found that there was consistently this positive effect of genetic variation in eelgrass on the response of that system to disturbance. Whether that disturbance was a heat wave, as in a European study that was going on at a similar time, or whether it was a human disturbance of me going in with scissors and removing biomass to see what would happen, or if it was a natural bloom of macroalgae that led to some mortality of the plants. In all cases, the more diverse plots did better. In addition, in some work led by Dr. Torrance Hanley in Nantucket, we found that even in natural populations, if we went out and measured how many genotypes we found in these plots, there was a really strong positive correlation with the density of that eelgrass, which is a really common metric of sort of the health of the system. More recently, in the lab, we've gotten very interested in the relationship between eelgrass genetic diversity and disease in this system. And this was work led by Dr. Forrest Schenck, who just finished his PhD and is now working full-time at Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. So Forrest led an experiment that was similar to the first one I told you about, but in this case, we grew the eelgrass in pots and did it in tanks in the lab. And so there were some pots that had all of a single genotype and some that had multiple different genotypes. We optimistically use colors to represent the different genotypes, even though they aren't actually that easy to identify by sight. And in this case, we subjected those different diversity treatments to a temperature stress. And we looked at the response of this eelgrass parasite, Labyrinthula zosterae, which is the causative agent of wasting disease. Now, you may have heard of wasting disease because it nearly wiped out eelgrass on the east coast of North America in the 1930s. It caused the first documented marine extinction of a limpet that lived on eelgrass. And so while we haven't seen really dramatic outbreaks of eelgrass recently, there's a lot of concern about understanding the potential impacts of this disease. And so forest work shows that if you elevate temperature, the severity of eelgrass wasting disease goes up. So this red dot relative to this white dot, but only if you're growing in a low diversity environment. So where all the genotypes are the same. If you have genetic variation among the different individuals in these experimental pots, then there's no longer this increase in disease severity in response to increased temperature. Okay, so while I've focused on seagrass, I just want to point out quickly, and would be happy to talk to anyone in more detail, that it doesn't appear to be just limited to seagrass. So in work we've done in oysters and in salt marsh plants, we continue to find this important role of genetic variation in how these systems operate. And this is really kind of exciting and important, I think, because if we consider the degree to which human impacts on the ocean are increasing, so shown in this bottom panel of this figure, while slower relative to our impacts on land, we know that we are having really dramatic effects on ocean ecosystems. And so genetic variation may not just be sort of important for this vague long-term evolutionary potential, but even for the short-term ecological response of these systems. In addition, for the coastal ecosystems that I focus on, including salt marshes, seagrasses, mangroves, and oyster reefs, we know that large proportions of those habitats have been lost. And so we spend a great deal of effort and a great deal of funding to try and restore these habitats. And so our work suggests that genetic diversity may be a really key component to these restoration efforts and helping them to be successful. But there's always the question of whether the science that we do actually gets conveyed effectively and translated into management and practice. And so a couple of years ago, we did a survey, an online survey of two organizations that are really active in coastal habitat restoration. The International Coral Reef Society, which as the name implies, focuses on corals, as well as the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation, which is really active in the other habitats that I mentioned. And when we asked them, how important do you think genetic variation is for restoration success? We saw a fair bit of variation. So ICRS, the Coral Reef Society, shown in blue, generally thinks that genetic variation is pretty important for restoration success, especially of corals. Whereas the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation respondents didn't seem to think that genetic variation was as important. And this is despite the fact that all the evidence that I've told you about today comes from seagrasses, which is one of the habitats that they focus on. And the other reason this is interesting is because many of these coastal habitats, including salt marsh plants, seagrasses, and corals, when we restore them, the restoration practitioners have to select the material that's used in the restoration. So many of them don't recruit naturally. So you have to go and either collect eelgrass and transplant it to a new location, or order some Spartine alterniflora from a nursery that has grown it for this restoration. And so this to me really sort of highlights the fact that these restoration efforts have real potential to influence the genetic variation that's present in these ecosystems. And so I think we've come to a point where we're feeling like we really can't understand how these coastal ecosystems operate without considering their interactions with people. And thankfully, we're not the first to have thought this. And there's a whole field looking at these coupled social and ecological systems. So this is work that was really pioneered by Dr. Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2009. So a little nice women's history note. And so she really recognized that these natural resources that humans depend on have these complex relationships and interactions with people and our management structures. And so the way that I think about this in the systems that I work in is we have this sort of these feedbacks between ecology and evolution that I started with that are really a key component of that is the genetic diversity in these systems. And that drives things like the resilience of these coastal habitats, which has important implications for the human side of this equation. Now we know there's complex interactions between human behavior and human outcomes, and that there's variation among groups, such as the variation I showed you between two organizations focused on coastal habitat restoration. And this influences habitat restoration practice, which again feeds back to the ecology and the evolution. And so despite the fact that I think many of us as marine ecologists, love to get underwater and really just focus on the habitats that we love and that we're interested in, I don't think we can ignore what's going on above and outside of the water. And so this is one of our key sites that's in the Nahant. And, you get a very different perspective of that habitat if you're underwater versus above and looking around at all the different potential impacts that are occurring to this eelgrass bed. And so I want to just take a few more minutes to think a little bit beyond the seagrass system and talk about how this same framework can apply to some of the other ecosystems that we're working in. and in particular, in relation to climate change, which is obviously impacting both human and natural systems. So we have a new project in the lab that was funded by the National Academy of Sciences Gulf Research Program that's interested in the expansion of mangroves into the northern Gulf of Mexico. So typically when we think of mangroves, we think of these really, you know, trees, beautiful forest, mangrove forest. But here is a black mangrove in St. Joe Bay, Florida, which is in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And so, you know, it's more of a shrub, but it can become quite abundant and is becoming quite abundant. And this one is, you know, several meters wide and about a meter tall, and has probably been in the system for 20 or 30 years at least. Mangroves traditionally have been kept out of this region by severe winter temperatures. So they are not terribly cold tolerant. You can see this is frost damage on this mangrove seedling from a couple of years ago from a severe cold spell. But as we know, those winters are warming and those cold spells are becoming less and less frequent, and that's allowing these mangroves to expand. So here's a map of the Gulf of Mexico. These areas that are sort of circled here at the top are the study region that's the focus of this project. And the interesting thing about this and the link to humans is that people have, in addition to sort of the indirect impacts on climate, we have the real potential to either speed up or slow down this range expansion. So we could speed it up if managers choose to use mangroves in living shorelines and restoration efforts because of their known impacts on reducing flow and wave damage. Or we could slow it down if, as in some regions, people are concerned about the impacts that mangroves may be having on salt marshes, and so they may be removing mangroves. And so we're just getting started on this project, and I don't have data to share, but I'm really excited to dive deeper into this and understand more of these interactions between our management actions and these natural systems. In addition, I'm going to highlight some work by Dr. Chris Nadeau, who is another postdoc in my research group. And you'll forgive me, these are not marine species, but Chris works in these really cool freshwater pools up in Acadia. And he works on this really charismatic, but not shown to scale invertebrate species, Daphnia. And so the nice thing about Daphnia is they're sort of a model experimental organism. We can do a lot of different manipulations with them that is much harder to do with longer lived plants like eelgrass. And we have a lot of information about sort of the thermal tolerance of these different Daphnia clones throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And so Chris is using this information to construct these really interesting and intricate manipulations of, all right, what happens if we pair Daphnia that have sort of cold or are less warm tolerant to those that are more warm tolerant, and does that increase the ability of these populations to deal with warming? And then he's also working with managers in Acadia to ask similar questions with a species, an alpine plant species of conservation concern, the three-toothed cinquefoil. And so I think this question of whether we can use our knowledge of genetic variation to enhance the capacity of these ecosystems to deal with climate stress is a really key one. And this is exciting work that Chris is leading. All right, so last point I want to make here is that when we're thinking about this framework and thinking about the way that these natural systems provide ecosystem benefits to humans, I think it's really critical now that we think more and more, not just about the delivery of ecosystem services, but the equitable distribution of those ecosystem benefits. So in work led by Professor John Grabowski, who's a longtime colleague here at Northeastern, we looked at federal coastal habitat restoration efforts in the United States over a 10-year period. And we're able to generate this map that shows by coastal counties, those that have had a large investment in habitat restoration and number of acres shown in sort of the darker colors versus less investment in coastal habitat restoration. And there's a lot of variability here, and there are a lot of factors that play into that, including just regional variation. But when we look to see, all right, what are some of the predictors that may tell us, where we see a lot of restoration versus not as much, two predictors came up. One was population density, and the other is gross domestic product, but not perhaps in the way we might think. So rather than more restoration being conducted in areas where there are more people that need more protection, we actually see that in the more urban areas, we have less restoration. And in terms of GDP, counties that had a higher GDP actually saw more restoration rather than the reverse. And so I'm not suggesting in any way that this is any sort of conscious decision or sort of nefarious policy, but just to point out that we're really good at measuring and thinking about the ecological impacts of restoration. And I think that we need to do a better job of considering sort of the community and economic and social effects of restoration, again, to make sure that we're not perpetuating sort of injustices or creating them. And so I'll just wrap up by saying, in the Hughes Lab, in terms of our research, we're really sort of centering people and figuring out how human and natural systems interact with one another. And I think that's really nice because it fits really well within this broader context, as Jeff mentioned, of the work we're doing in the college and in our department to think about how we can promote equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. And so, yeah, it's just nice to have sort of consistency across like all my worlds in this focus on equity. And as I mentioned at the outset, there are lots of folks in the Hughes Lab that have contributed to this work, as well as funding agencies and various partners. And I'll just leave you with my favorite little cartoon about the dodos that says we're the last dodos on the planet. So we've put all of our eggs safely into this one basket. And with that, I'm happy to stop sharing and answer any questions.
I'd like to thank Randall, Professor Hughes, for really just a stunning discussion of her scholarship here. And the thing that really strikes me is this connection that you have between people and the environment, that it's not a separate kind of aspect here. Can you comment on that a little bit, the view that you're taking that really connects society with preservation of the environment rather than thinking of the environment as a kind of a separate entity that is different from the trajectories of societies, particularly economic trajectories?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is definitely an aspect of my research that's really developed and flourished by being here at Northeastern, because I think Jeff is one of sort of the early proponents of the fact that we tend to think about, all right, let's place our marine labs and our marine research in the most pristine place that we can find. But we know that, most people live on the coast, most of our major cities are on the coast. And so we really need to start to understand the interactions that people are having with their coastlines, because we really can't separate the two anymore. And so I think that's an area that Northeastern's really leading and thinking about with folks like Stephen Cyphers and John Grabowski and Brian Helmuth, and many others. But those are just some of the folks in our department who have really contributed to how I think about this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that discussion. We invite questions, comments, thoughts from the many people in our audience today, please.
Phil, I saw you raise your hand. Will you type your question into the chat for us? Hazel, should I just respond directly to things in the chat? Is that?
You know, Randall, I think that is exactly what you should do. That is
Okay.
brilliant. If you are smart enough to actually be seeing questions in the chat, then this is my job, everyone. But I'm trying to digest Randall's discussion. So yes, please do.
Okay.
There's a couple
I'll
of terrific
answer
questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll answer Phil since I requested that he ask it of me. So the question is, do I know of any study that's followed genetic diversity in a single meadow or marsh through time to understand the factors that may cause that to change? It's a great question. Most studies, well, there are several marsh studies that have compared marshes of different ages to try and get an understanding of how genetic diversity may change through time. But that's not a perfect comparison. We have some data over sort of relatively short time periods, say 1 to 3 years, and that you really don't see big changes over that time frame. We have some seagrass data, again, looking at relatively short time frames, but I think this is one of the, it's a great question. It's one we hope to address, and it's one that unfortunately sort of falls outside of typical funding cycles and typical sort of PhD projects, because the time periods we're interested in are longer than either of those. But I think there is the potential for interesting interactions in that genetic diversity may beget more genetic diversity. And those are processes we're interested in diving into, but I don't have a great, I don't know of any really wonderful data sets on that yet.
There's another question. Thank you, Randall. There's another question, asking about what we can do, what the public can do to help preserve coastlines. There is a tremendous interest in having people who are not scholars and researchers in the field, but feel very strongly about preserving the environment and promoting social equity associated with the environment. But there's the question of, how is that best done across people who are not directly part of this research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a couple of things come to mind. One is that there are an increasing number of sort of community science or citizen science efforts, especially around planting living shorelines or helping with restoration efforts. And so I think that's a great way for the public to get involved in these projects. I think also sort of really simple things like thinking about whether you fertilize your lawn or whether you have a lawn or not, because of general concerns about nutrient runoff, and just being more aware as you see sort of development happening, whether that's, thinking a little bit about, whether that's in a good location. Should we be developing our coastline right along the water when we know that sea level rise is occurring? I think just increasing awareness of these issues and sort of seeing sort of relationships between our coastal ecosystems and issues that maybe you don't always relate to them directly.
Thank you so much. There's a question from Teresa. How can we best gauge human interactions with coastal ecosystems? It's a complex question, very important.
Yeah, that is a great question. Thanks, Teresa. I think some of the tools that we use to try and understand human interactions with our natural ecosystems, we do a lot of surveys and interviews with people. There's an interesting quote that someone said to me recently is, we have to think a little differently though about how we are studying people versus how we study natural ecosystems, because we're always influencing our interactions with people. And so that's something we have to think about. But I think, basically we need to rely on, social scientists have been doing this for a long time. So I don't pretend that this is my expertise. And so I think collaborating with folks who are really well-versed in these social science techniques is really critical to understanding these interactions.
Very interesting. There's a talk here, there's a question here from Molly about how can you expand on how species like mangroves migrate north in response to rising temperatures? It seems like that's a very general question. That's a specific one, but the general question of how the range of species changes with changing temperature and then the impact of that. These seem like extremely important questions. What is your response to that, Randall?
Yeah, so range expansions and especially, migrating north in the Northern Hemisphere in response to climate change is a really general observation among a lot of species. And I think, especially for species that are even more marine than mangroves, they're facilitated by connections, current connections and sort of connections within the oceans, because first they have to get there in order to expand their range. Then there's the question of, can they survive in that new location? And so what we are seeing with mangroves in the Northern Gulf is it's relatively rare that you get a big influx of, say, new propagules or new recruits from farther south. But once they get to an area and are able to survive, then they can just start successfully reproducing and form sort of a self-sustaining population. And so it doesn't have to necessarily take a lot of these sort of long distance dispersal events to allow for these range migrations, as long as once they get there, they are able to survive. And so with the mangroves, like, we're closely watching. Obviously, there was the horrific freeze that had such human consequences in Texas recently. It also had major impacts on the mangroves in northern Texas, potentially really high mortality because of the severe cold that happened. And that didn't happen in Louisiana and Alabama and Florida. And so some of our colleagues are down there taking data now to get a better handle on what sorts of impacts that may have and how it may influence the trajectory of this expansion.
Thank you. There's a question here asking about what sites in Rhode Island did you visit? Do you know? Can you?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of our oyster work in Rhode Island. And so we work in the coastal ponds there, primarily Ninigret Pond and Quanchitog Pond. I honestly can't remember exactly when in the talk I referenced Rhode Island, but those are the areas that we tend to work in. Really neat systems. And it's because, yeah, we partner really closely with Rhode Island, a Division of Environmental Management, on their oyster restoration efforts, and doing those in an experimental framework so that we can learn more about oyster restoration success, much in the way that I talked about seagrass.
All right, well, I'm sure there are further questions. I know it takes a while to form these and to then feel comfortable asking them. I always say any question is fair game, and go right ahead and ask it.
Absolutely.
But I am sure that Professor Hughes will be happy to take some questions later on if you remember them, and drop her an email. Absolutely terrific. So I want to thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful group to welcome to this talk by Professor Randall Hughes. I want to thank Professor Hughes for really sharing her deeply important, lucid research with us. It is so interesting to hear you talk about your research, Randall. Randall and I work very closely together on issues of equity and diversity, and it's an honor to work with her in that regard. but it's an equal honor to hear about the work that you are doing and its importance, and to understand the eminence you have in the field, even at this relatively early stage in your career. So congratulations, and thank you so much for sharing with us. I'd like to thank you all for attending. We are always so glad to see you at College of Science Connect's events. We are so glad to feature the Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences. And I'd like to thank Professor Trussell for doing the honors and the welcome. And with that, I am going to thank you again and to say have a great afternoon.
Great job, Randall.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending.
Take care, everyone.